Thank you for being a friend. Travel down the road and back again. Your heart is true, you're a pal and a confidant. If you threw a party and invited everyone you knew, you would see the biggest gift would be from me, and the card attached would say, thank you for being a friend.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to Beloved Journal every week. It means so much to me that you yourself choose to listen to this podcast and listen to what I have to say, but more importantly, to what our guests have to say. We have an incredible guest for you today, and I hope you will enjoy listening to him as much as I enjoyed recording this interview. Dr. Gary Scott Smith is Professor of History Emeritus at Grove City College, where he taught from 1978 to 2017. He is now retired, living the life in Wilmington, North Carolina. He chaired the history department while at the college, though, and he holds a Master of Divinity degree from Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, along with a Master of Arts and PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He has written extensively on the faith of the United States presidency and is considered an expert in the field. He's also written books on Jackie Robinson's, on Winston Churchill's, and Hillary Clinton's faith as well. Dr. Smith currently serves on my dissertation committee at the Pacific School of Religion, as my doctoral work is on the faith of the American presidency. And you can check out more of that on our sister podcast, So Help Me Pod. You can search that wherever you get your podcasts. And I hope you find that meaningful as well. But for today, he's on Beloved Journal, and we're so grateful that he's here. I certainly felt that I was sitting at the feet of a master in this podcast, so I know you will enjoy it as well. With that in mind, let's listen in. Dr. Gary Smith, thank you so much for coming on Beloved Journal.
My pleasure to be with you, Rob.
Well, Gary, I was telling my mom before I had this interview with you that you are what I want to be when I grow up. You have accomplished so much in the field that I am so passionate about. But my question is, how did you find yourself so interested and so kind of in the middle of the intersection of presidential history and religion?
Well, I suppose it goes all the way back to 8th grade, Rob, when I first became very interested in the presidents. And eventually I went on to Johns Hopkins and got a PhD in American religious history. And so that's been my career area of research and publications. And I had written a couple other books before I got interested in the presidency and religion. But I was really intrigued by the fact that very little had been done as of the year 2000, when I started my research on the faith of presidents. And I reasoned that it was a very important topic that had been sorely neglected, and that would be a fruitful topic to explore, and that lots of people would be potentially interested in knowing about the faith of presidents. Because we've long had a fascination with our presidents. Pretty much every facet of their lives has been mined in one way or another. But prior to the early part of the 21st century, very little had been done in exploring the faith of presidents, especially how it impacted them in their time in office. And so I decided to explore that issue at length. I was blessed to get some good money from the Earhart Foundation in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that allowed me to go to a wide variety of presidential libraries and do research there and see materials that no one else had perhaps ever seen, or at least had ever written about. So that was a huge blessing over the course of my research to have that funding. And it was really fun to go and be in the archives and find things that no one else had ever talked about. And also then I would be there and I would go to their museums and compare how they presented themselves in their museums with how I saw their role as presidents, and talk about it if there was any faith connection in their museums, depending on who the presidents were. So that's how I got interested in it. And as you well know, in the last 15 years or so, I published my first book on the faith of presidents in 2006. And since that time, there has been an expansion of interest in the subject and a lot more written about it by a wide variety of scholars, some individual religious biographies, and some collections of various presidents, like my two books.
So my mind's spinning because I imagine it must have been the most incredible feeling to be in those archives and to unearth some of that stuff that you were finding that may have been passed over for whatever reason. It just wasn't being researched or whatever. I mean, that just must have been an incredible feeling. But I'm curious. I want to go back to the eighth grade for a second. Was there any aspiration on your part to be president? Is there like a Gary Smith like bumper sticker or something that we were missing somewhere in the annals of history? Or is this just because what is it about the presidency that caused you to literally give your life and career to study a portion of it?
Well, no, I never had an aspiration to be president of the United States, although I was on student council in high school, and I was a student government representative in college, and in seminary, I was a vice president for academic affairs. So I've had a wide variety of governance experiences on a much lower level. I think it was the fact that I think sometimes we attribute too much power to presidents, um, particularly in terms of how they might shape the economy. I mean, if the economy is going great guns, we say, what a great president. If it's doing poorly, we blame the president, and they really have not that much influence on how the global economy functions. But they do have a lot of impact on foreign policy, and they certainly have a lot of impact on selected domestic policies, and they certainly have potentially great influence on shaping the character of our country and getting their strongest interests out there in the media. Teddy Roosevelt referred to the presidency as the bully pulpit. So a chance to exalt whatever issues they think are important into the public consciousness. So maybe it's a form of hero worship on some level. Our presidents are certainly among our greatest heroes, but we've got sports heroes and we've got celebrities in invention and a wide variety of other fields. But I've just found the presidents to be rather fascinating in terms of their backgrounds, their contributions, what they did before, and in some cases after their time in office.
It's so funny that we're actually doing this podcast today because I was in the car rider line picking up my daughter, and I was reading your book, Religion in the Oval Office. I mean, like it's kind of a surreal, meta moment of just worlds colliding. Because I'm, of course, for full disclosure, you're on my dissertation committee. But that said, I think your book is really helpful for the work I'm doing, and so I'm curious, like that book. It's a hefty book. You did a lot of research on it. You learned a lot. What was there something in that book that really surprised you beyond all else as you were doing research? Was there something that you came across that was like, oh my gosh, this is really profound that you felt other people might not know and you might like to share? And by the way, people should, of course, buy the book. But I mean, what about that book in particular? That one's the one that's really impressed me the most of your work. What about it surprised you as you wrote it?
Well, just for a little context here. So I wrote the first book, Faith in the Presidency, and it came out, as I mentioned, in 2006. And originally I had included 14 different presidents in that book, and it was about 1,000 pages and way beyond what an academic publisher wanted to publish. And so fortunately, I had a very good editor at Oxford University Press who helped me pare down about 30% of it. But it also involved getting rid of 3 chapters, which then I decided later on when the book you referred to came out, that I would do a second volume of 11 more presidents, which at the time gave me 50% of the presidents. And arguably the 50% for whom religion was the most significant, with the exception of Garfield. And I didn't talk about him because I was focusing on public policy. And when you get shot 3.5 months into your presidency and die 7 months into your presidency, there's not a lot of public policy to be analyzed. So I think what surprised me the most was simply how significant the faith of presidents was, and how it could be so much neglected by their biographers. I mean, so many presidents kind of echoed the famous statement of Abraham Lincoln that I got down on my knees to pray to God, I'm paraphrasing, because I didn't know where else to go. I mean, the immense pressures of my office, particularly when you get into the 20th century, and the United States is arguably the global leader, decisions that are going to impact the entire nation and the entire world. Who wants to make those decisions on their own without, obviously you want to have a great cabinet, you want to have trusted advisors, you want to have the House and Senate on behind what you're doing. But ultimately, if you don't have a divine, if God is not important in your life and you don't believe that God is providentially controlling the universe, then I think that puts you in a very precarious and anxiety-filled situation. And so, so many presidents have said, in the toughest of times, I went to God and my faith was strengthened when I was in office. Barack Obama has said that. Numerous other presidents have said the same thing. But just to give you one tidbit along the lines of what you're talking about, so few people would understand that Franklin Roosevelt, who's not necessarily known as one of our most religiously devout presidents, but he was the senior warden of an Episcopal church in Hyde Park, New York, called St. James, the entire time he was president of the United States. And he really made no political capital about it. He didn't really publicize it. He would often interrupt meetings in the Oval Office to take a call from the other senior warden back in New York to talk about business of the church. He's got this $1 billion budget as president, and he's trying to balance a $100,000 budget of the local Episcopal church because it's really important to him. So, I mean, I could give you many other illustrations along that line. One of my favorite stories is, this is in the volume you just referred to, Religion in the Oval Office, is John Quincy Adams, who's one of our most religious presidents, typically went to church 3 times every Sunday in Washington, D.C. He'd go to a Presbyterian church in the morning, an Episcopal church in the afternoon, and a Unitarian church in the evening, or vice versa. But anyway, he almost drowned in the Potomac one early in his presidency, and when he managed to get back to the boat and not drowned, he again gave credit to God for sparing him. Ronald Reagan had the same kind of experience after he was shot. He said, why did God keep me alive? What's my purpose? Which is an interesting question to ask when you're already president of the United States. But he basically rededicated his life to God at that point. And his faith was much stronger after the Hinckley shots hit him than they had been before. So on and on the stories go, but there were lots of tidbits like that were intriguing, or just to know that a president was in touch with religious leader through correspondence or meetings that had not been discussed before in print that I had seen.
It's so interesting, looking in more recent and even current events, which is dangerous sometimes for historians to do. The likely candidates for both parties in the 2024 election couldn't be farther apart in their own personal religious expression or experience. And recognizing that you are a historian and not a pundit, I'm not asking you to weigh in on that. I wonder how you see this, though, divergence, if you will, of religious experience and viewpoints between political parties, candidates, what have you. Does that portend something for this country? Does that say something about where this country is currently, as opposed to where it's been in the past?
Well, as you well know, we've had a significant increase of nuns in the last 15 years. That is, people with no religious affiliation. Church attendance is down, partly relating to the pandemic, partly relating to younger generations that don't seem to be as interested in being involved in the life of the church as their parents and grandparents have been. That said, numerous polls in the 20th century, 21st century have indicated that Americans want their presidents to be people of faith. They don't want them to be religious zealots. That scares them. But they want them to have solid faith. They want them to be people who pray. They want to be people who have a moral compass. I'm speaking in generalities here. And they feel more comfortable when that's the case. Now, Republicans, historically, at least since Eisenhower, have been more oriented toward religion. Their presidential candidates and presidents have been more outspoken about religious faith than Democrats. But that's not to say that there are exceptions there. Obviously, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, even Barack Obama have talked quite a bit about their faith. They've been interviewed by Christianity Today. They've been interviewed by other religious outlets. They've talked about their faith in the campaign trail. They participated in faith forums. So, all that kind of stuff has been significant. But any Democrat, as Hillary Clinton experienced in 2016, has a tougher road to hoe when campaigning because the Democratic Party has a wider spectrum philosophically, religiously than the Republican Party. And you've got a lot more people who are nuns, unchurched, even professed atheists, or even antagonistic toward religion. And you don't have that long association since the 1980s with conservative religion and their party that make it more difficult. It's a broader tent. It's a bigger umbrella. And even though I argue in a book that I just have coming out on the faith of Hillary Clinton, I argue that her faith has been a driving force in her life. I argue she didn't do as much with her faith in the campaign as she might have. And in a really closely contested election, it might have been enough to make the difference if she'd gotten just a couple percent higher of the evangelical vote, if she'd even gotten what Barack Obama had gotten. So anyway, that said, there's certainly been in recent times, I mean, all the way back to Eisenhower, we've had presidents who've had liaisons to particular religious communities. And during the campaigns, we've had liaisons to Catholics, to evangelicals, to sometimes mainline Protestants, to Jews. So there have been efforts to reach out to specific religious communities. And to the extent that they've been successful, they've helped candidates win elections, especially ones that have been very, very close.
It's interesting. You mentioned Hillary Clinton. Secretary Clinton is one of those people who is probably as close to have been president as anyone else could have been. So I think it's fair to sometimes include her in these conversations. And when I think of Secretary Clinton, I think she's more Methodist than some Methodist ministers I know. I mean, she is profoundly convicted by her faith, and that influenced, of course, her husband, President Clinton. And they often attended Foundry Church in D.C., which is a beautiful Methodist church. And it's not only attending church, right? Like the deep personal convictions of the people who have either been right there at the office, like Secretary Clinton, or people who have held that office. It is both personal and it is public. And that has always fascinated me because it's easy to, in some senses, there's obviously logistical concerns to attend church as president. It could be considered easy to attend a church, but to have that personal, deep conviction it might be a little more difficult when you're dealing with the affairs of state, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've got examples of presidents who were fairly outspoken publicly about faith, but had little private faith to speak of. And when that happens, we tend to think that that's a political ploy, that it's perhaps disingenuous, that it's a put on simply to influence voters. On the other hand, we've had some candidates who've been very, very personally pious. Jimmy Carter stands out to me, and he certainly spoke a lot on the campaign trail about his faith, but he was somewhat guarded as president. Part of that Baptist separation of church and state mentality. I don't want to infringe upon the, the lack of faith of some other Americans. I certainly don't want to be seen as overstepping my boundaries and being too favorable toward Baptists. Or same thing with John F. Kennedy. He wasn't religiously well. He attended mass pretty much all the time, but there's no evidence that he was particularly personally religiously devout. But a lot of Catholic leaders said we would have been better off if Nixon had been elected, because Kennedy bent over backwards not to show any favoritism toward the Catholic Church during his time in office, right? So there's certainly that issue. But back to Clinton, yeah, you're absolutely right. Raised in a youth group in a Methodist church in Chicago. Faith was meaningful, part of a campus fellowship in college. When she goes to Arkansas and becomes the wife of the governor, Bill, she's very deeply involved in a Little Rock Methodist church. And, she goes around the state giving lectures on Methodism and talks about her faith. And as First Lady, she's part of a women's Bible study. As a senator, she's part of a Senate prayer group. She reads voraciously in religious devotional literature and Christianity Today, of all things. One might have thought Christian Century, but no, Christianity Today. Her faith is deeply informing who she is, and therefore influences. I try to make a case in the book about public policy and how many policies, and I focus a lot on her time as, you called her Secretary Clinton, but as Secretary of State, when she had the ability to shape the agenda of that department of our government, and how much her faith determined what she did in terms of reaching out to women and children and trying to improve their opportunities and rights within the world, and a variety of other issues that she supported. But yeah, so there is the public side, there's the private side, and in some cases there's a genuine continuity between those two in the life of the president, and sometimes the private's deeper than the public, and more often the public is more overt than the private, or more important perhaps than the private.
We've had a few presidents that were a whisker away from being preachers. I think of both Adams presidents who could have easily been preachers in their own rights. John Adams being a church-going animal, self-described. I think of James A. Garfield, who you mentioned earlier. I just finished a fabulous book on him. But being a lay preacher in the Disciples of Christ. Preaching whenever he had the opportunity about whatever was on his mind or whatever came to his heart. And then, I think I had the opportunity a few years back to preach at Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia, where Jimmy Carter taught Sunday school. And it was a humbling experience to play second fiddle. No one came to hear me preach. They could have cared less about what I said, but they were there to hear the President of the United States teach Sunday school. I'm curious, do you think there's something personality-wise about that people, these two professions, these two realities, President of the United States preaching, pastoral ministry, is there a relationship there? Is there something that you see that connects the two or not?
Not necessarily overtly, but I think you might have the same type of person drawn to both the presidency and politics and to the church and ministry, because they're frankly both great opportunities for service. They're great opportunities to help shape the character of our nation, help push our nation in certain directions. So that's the connection, I guess I would see, is that the presidency and the preacher share certain similar potential goals and opportunities.
I realized that was a dangerous question to ask as a pastor. That could have gone a lot of different ways. So I'm glad it was. Service is a great answer. Listen, I got this question that's been nagging at me of late, that I've been thinking about. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, some of these earlier presidents. A lot of people tend to keep praise onto them for their religiosity, and of course, Washington was a vestryman. You've got some participation in some various ways of the earlier presidents, and yet in some ways they're not exactly what we would consider part and parcel for that of the Christian, mainline or Catholic or evangelical traditions. What do you make of that attempt to, in some ways, either caricaturize or characterize these men as something that they were deists? I mean, in large parts of their faith were deistic. So how do you separate that out in your own studies?
Well, first of all, I like to refer to them as, borrowing a phrase from a colleague at the Master's College in California, as theistic rationalists rather than deists.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
Because to me, a deist, at least the traditional deist, and they talk about warm deists and adjective deists and so on, but the traditional deist doesn't believe in prayer, doesn't believe in providence, and has a very low view of Scripture. Okay, and I certainly don't see that to be the case for Washington. And Jefferson arguably has a low view of Scripture in that he gets rid of 4/5 of it because it's too supernaturalistic. But both of those guys talk a fair amount about the importance of prayer and the role of providence in American history. So that said, I think that essentially they were Unitarians. They believe in God the Father, but they don't believe Jesus is divine. They believe he's a great moral teacher. They commit the fallacy that C.S. Lewis says we shouldn't do, right? In Mere Christianity. But that said, I would argue that why? Because there are so many Christians in our country who buy into some form of Christian nationalism or some form of America as a Christian nation. And it's partly because they're Christians and they want to see our country's history in that way. Partly it's they're influenced by certain popularizers, maybe David Barton being the leading one, who make that argument, I think, without a lot of subtlety and without a lot of true footnoting of sources. So that said, if you're going to think of America as a Christian nation, then you're going to probably paint the founding fathers as much more Christian than they actually were. And there were a number of Christian founding fathers who were deeply Christian. I could name 10 of them probably, but John Hancock would be one example. Samuel Adams would be another. Elias Boudinot, and on it goes. Patrick Henry, but certainly not the first three presidents of the United States, all of whom are arguably Unitarians. So anyway, I think it's and you can go to the state constitutions and their mention of God and even their enshrining of Christianity in some ways within the documents. So there's a rich Christian history to our country, but there's also a very there are a number of strands that came together from the Enlightenment, from what we might later call secular humanism, from Christianity, or the Judeo-Christian tradition that make the country what it is.
So final question for you, final Jeopardy round. I do want to pass my dissertation, so I'm going to be careful how I ask this because it's an impossible question to ask. But that said, who is your favorite president and why?
Yeah, I
See,
have
that's
trouble.
impossible. I lost it right there.
Yeah.
But who is your favorite president and why?
I have trouble narrowing it down to one individual because I like a lot of them. They have a lot of great attributes personally, and I think almost all of them did some good for our country. And it's not like, in my judgment, one president is head and shoulders above the rest from a religious perspective or even from a policy perspective. I mean, you look at all the polling data, and it's Washington, Lincoln, FDR who tend to dominate as the most respected presidents. I mean, as somebody who's a lifelong Republican, it's a moderate Republican, certainly, and now an independent.
You have to clarify that now, I guess,
Yeah.
right? Like you can't just,
Yes.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry. I didn't mean,
Who's drifted from the fold because of certain recent developments.
Yep.
I would, in some ways, I got to like Franklin Roosevelt because I think he was president during extremely tough times, both with the Great Depression and World War II, and he had a tough line to follow between those who were pushing for the United States to get into World War II, Winston Churchill being a leading example, but people within this country, and then people who, didn't want us to be involved in all and felt that it would be disastrous for us to get involved. And I think he did a great job of negotiating the difficulties there. I like a lot of what he says in some of his main addresses about the nature of faith. I love the D-Day prayer that he does right after the Normandy invasion. So I love the fact that he had deeply flawed man like the rest of us. He had an extramarital affair, but still his faith, I think, was deep and meaningful. And I don't think he would have been where he was, particularly after he contracted polio, without his faith.
Well, Dr. Gary Scott Smith, thank you so much for this time. I could honestly talk to you for hours, and I know we will later this semester when we do a dissertation review, but I'm so grateful for your witness. I feel like I've already learned so much from you, and I want to thank you for coming on my podcast.
Well, Rob, it's been my pleasure, and I hope that all your research and writing goes well, and I'm looking forward to your defense. I'm sure it'll be a red letter day.
Beloved Journal is a podcast on a mission. Check out our other episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Today's podcast was hosted by the Reverend Rob Lee. Find him on Twitter @RobLee4 or on Instagram @RevRobLee. You can find our social media on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter by searching for Beloved Journal and finding our logo. Beloved Journal's theme music is a cover of the Golden Girls theme song done by Mipsa. Seriously, they're the best band in the world. This podcast was the dream of Stephanie Lee and was produced by Maggie the Golden Doodle and Frank the Poodle. Go show the world that it's worth fighting for. And as always, thanks for listening.